My son looked me in the eye and said, "From now on, your paycheck goes into my account. You don't need anything anyway." I just smiled and said, "All right, son, whatever you think is best." He had no idea what was coming. That night, like always, they came over for their free dinner, smug, certain I'd surrendered. But when they walked in, they froze. Their faces went pale. Because sitting at that table was someone they never expected to see. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy powerful, true family and revenge stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. It helps more people find these real-life lessons. I gave him everything: my time, my savings, my love. I wanted him to have the life I never had. When my husband passed away, I was 39, and the world suddenly became colder. There were nights I would come home from my second shift at the diner, my hands still smelling of coffee and bleach, only to find my little boy asleep on the couch waiting for me, the TV humming softly in the dark. He was my reason to keep breathing. I told myself that if I just worked hard enough, he'd never have to live with the kind of struggle I knew. Every penny I earned went toward his schooling, his dreams, his comfort. I wore the same shoes for years, patched the same coat every winter, just so he could walk into school without feeling less than anyone else. He grew up watching me push through exhaustion, but somewhere along the way, I think he mistook my strength for something he could take for granted. Maybe I shielded him too much from how hard life can be. I wanted him to know security, not survival. And so, I kept giving holidays, rent, car repairs, the little extras that mothers always find a way to provide. When he married, I helped them with the down payment for their first apartment, cooked their meals every Sunday, and smiled every time they left with leftovers. It never occurred to me that love could turn into a ledger, that my sacrifices would someday be treated like debts owed. I used to look at him and see the boy who once held my hand crossing the street. Now, I saw a man who barely looked back when I spoke. Maybe that was my mistake, giving too much to someone who never learned to give back. At first, when my son brought her home, I was overjoyed. She was polite, charming, even the kind of woman who spoke sweetly and called me Mom, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I remember thinking, maybe this is the family I always dreamed of: laughter around the table, grandchildren someday, peace at last. But peace has a way of disguising itself before it breaks you. In the beginning, she offered to help with dishes, complimented my cooking, and asked about my health. I mistook her questions for care. Soon, she began making little comments, quiet, almost harmless things that slipped between conversations like thin blades. "Maybe you shouldn't be living alone at your age, Mom," she said once, glancing at my son. Another time, when I offered to help them pay a small bill, she smiled and whispered, "You're such a giving woman. It must be exhausting carrying everything on your own." I didn't realize it then, but she was studying me: every habit, every fear, every way she could turn my love into leverage. Before long, my son stopped calling as often. When he did, his tone had changed. He spoke like someone repeating lines fed to him. "Mom, you shouldn't be wasting money on repairs," he said one evening over the phone. "You should just let us handle your finances. It's safer that way." I laughed it off, thinking it was just concern. But slowly, the visits changed too. Every Sunday, they came with empty hands and full stomachs, and I pretended not to notice. I'd cook their favorites: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, peach cobbler, and they'd eat like they hadn't seen food all week. My kitchen became their free restaurant, my home, their weekend retreat. After dinner, my daughter-in-law would wander through my house, touching things that weren't hers: my late husband's watch, old family photos, the crystal bowl my mother left me. "Oh, this would look perfect in our dining room," she'd say with a smirk. My son would chuckle awkwardly, but never stopped her. Sometimes, when I'd hand them leftovers to take home, she'd joke, "You spoil us too much. It's no wonder he's such a mama's boy." The words were dipped in honey, but they stung all the same. Week after week, they'd leave with full plates and empty gratitude. My son's eyes no longer met mine. He'd scroll through his phone while I spoke, nodding absently, while she laughed at something only she seemed to understand. Then came the nights when they didn't come at all. No call, no message, just silence. When I'd ask, she'd say, "Oh, we've been so busy, Mom. You know how life gets. But don't worry, we'll be there when you need us. And eventually, when they did show up, it wasn't for dinner, it was for discussion. About my bills, my income, my retirement. The polite smile she once wore was gone. Now, she spoke with ownership as though my life, my home, and even my paycheck were theirs to manage. That was when I began to see the truth. The sweet daughter-in-law I'd welcomed into my home had become the quiet architect of my son's new heart. And little by little, she was building a wall between us, one I didn't know how to tear down. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, just after I'd returned from the grocery store. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. My son arrived unannounced, no smile, no small talk, just a cold expression I barely recognized. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd done his homework as a boy. "Mom," he began, his tone rehearsed, "we need to talk about your finances." I set my purse down slowly. "What about them?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "You're getting older. It's time I take over. From now on, your paycheck goes into my account. You don't need it. I'll manage your money better." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My paycheck, the one I earned, working double shifts at the diner, the one I used to keep food on his plate and shoes on his feet. I looked at him, my own flesh and blood, and saw no hesitation in his eyes. Only entitlement, only the shadow of a woman's influence behind him. "You'll manage my money better?" I asked quietly. He nodded, as if explaining something simple to a child. "It's for your own good, Mom. You've done enough, just let me handle things now." I wanted to ask when he'd forgotten the value of sacrifice, when he'd stopped remembering that I was the one who taught him to stand, to read, to love. But instead, I smiled faintly, almost kindly, and reached into my purse. I pulled out my checkbook and placed it on the table. "All right, son," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "Whatever you think is best." He looked surprised, even relieved, mistaking my silence for surrender. He didn't see the storm behind my eyes, the ache, the disappointment, the quiet understanding that something sacred between us had just broken. He thought he had won, but he didn't understand that a mother's silence is never empty. It's watchful, it's calculating, and when the time comes, it speaks louder than any anger ever could. From that day on, I let him believe he was in control. He took my card, set up transfers, called it responsibility. I let him taste the power he thought he'd earned. Every month, he'd smile as he checked my account, saying things like, "You'll thank me someday, Mom." And I'd nod, holding back the words I wanted to scream that I had trusted him, not because he was my son, but because I needed to see just how far he'd go. If you've ever given your all to someone only for them to take you for granted, hit the like button right now. Let's see how many strong mothers, grandmothers, and women are watching who know this pain too. Because what I did next wasn't out of anger, it was out of love and self-respect. It started with little humiliations, quiet, cutting moments that told me exactly how low I'd been pushed. One afternoon, I stood in line at the pharmacy, clutching my small basket of essentials, my medication, some bread, and a carton of milk. When I handed the cashier my card, she smiled politely, then frowned. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said, lowering her voice. "It's been declined." I felt the eyes of strangers on me, the whispers, the pity. I tried again, pretending it was just a glitch, but it failed once more. My face burned. I fumbled in my purse, searching for a few crumpled bills, but all I had were coins. That's when I realized my son had emptied my account without a word. I left the store, groceries behind, my chest tight with shame. On the walk home, I called him, but he didn't answer. I called again, straight to voicemail. Later, I texted him. The card didn't work. Did something happen? Hours passed before he replied, "Oh yeah, I moved the money. Don't worry, we'll get what you need later." We'll get what you need. The words stung more than I expected. I wasn't we. I was his mother, the woman who once skipped meals so he could eat. That night, as rain tapped softly against the kitchen window, I sat alone at the same table where he'd once told me, "You don't need anything." The silence hurt more than the betrayal. I looked around, the walls still carried echoes of his childhood laughter. The framed photos of birthdays and graduations smiling back at me like ghosts of a time when love was enough. My phone buzzed. A message. It was from her, my daughter-in-law. "You really should let go, Mom. It's less stressful when someone else handles things. We're just trying to help." The kind of message that hides its cruelty behind kindness. I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. There are moments in life when pain reaches a point where it no longer burns, it hardens. And that night, something inside me hardened too. I sat there, the ticking clock echoing in the emptiness, and I remembered something my husband once told me years ago, back when times were hard and we had almost nothing. We'd lost our savings then too, a crooked partner, a failed business. I was crying, saying we'd have to start over. He took my hand and said, "Money can come and go, but your dignity that's worth more than any bank account." His words came back to me like a light in the dark, and as I sat in that kitchen, I realized I had given everything I could. But I had one thing left that they couldn't take without my permission: my dignity. And that was about to change everything. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. I hadn't really slept. My mind was clear, sharp in a way it hadn't been in years. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how to please anyone. I was thinking about how to protect what was left of me. As I made myself a cup of coffee, I stared at my phone for a long moment, scrolling through my old contacts. Then I saw a familiar name, Michael Carter. It had been nearly 20 years since we'd spoken. Michael was once a lawyer in town, known for his kindness more than his fees. Years ago, after his wife passed away, I used to stop by his house every few days with warm meals. I never asked for anything in return. I just couldn't stand the thought of him eating alone. That morning, I called him. When he picked up, his voice was older, raspier, but warm. "Well, if it isn't Mary Thompson, I was beginning to think you'd forgotten all about us old folk," he said with a light chuckle. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Michael," I said quietly, "I need your help, and this time, it's serious." There was a pause on the line, then his tone shifted. "Where do you want to meet?" We met later that afternoon at a small cafe near the courthouse, the same one we used to visit years ago when life was simpler. The air smelled of brewed coffee and rain-dampened streets. He looked older but still sharp, eyes that saw through politeness, straight into truth. I told him everything: how my husband had passed away 15 years ago, how my son and his wife slowly tightened their grip on my life, how I'd been stripped of control over my own money. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just listened to myself speak, as if I were telling someone else's story. Michael didn't interrupt. When I finished, he leaned back, folded his hands, and said, "You've been far too patient, Mary, but it's not too late to take your life back." He opened his briefcase, pulling out some papers. "First, we'll move your funds into a protected account, one they can't touch. Then, we'll update your will. If they've been treating you like a burden, we'll see how they feel when they realize they're not getting what they think they are." I sat quietly, listening as he outlined everything step by step. The legal language sounded cold, but beneath it, I heard something powerful: freedom. He guided me through forms, signatures, new authorizations. We set up automatic transfers to my new account, closed the joint one, and left behind only what they expected to see. By the time we were done, it was late afternoon. The sky had darkened, and soft rain streaked the cafe windows. Michael gathered the papers into his folder and said, "You don't owe them your peace, Mary. You've earned it." I nodded slowly. My hands trembled a bit as I signed the final document, not from fear, but from relief. As I stood to leave, Michael touched my shoulder and said, "When the time comes, don't warn them. Let them find out the way they taught you through silence." I looked at him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "I won't say a word," I said. Walking back home, I felt lighter. The streets glistened under streetlights, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a victim. I was still the same woman they thought they controlled, but now I was holding the pen to write the ending myself. The days that followed felt eerily calm, like the stillness that settles before a storm. I went about my routine, as if nothing had changed. I watered the plants, folded laundry, and walked down to the grocery store with my little list, just as I always did. But inside, I was no longer the woman they thought they could control. Each movement, each smile, every quiet breath carried a purpose now. They believed they had taken everything from me, but they didn't know I had already taken something back, something far greater than money. My freedom. On Saturday morning, I polished the silverware they'd once mocked as old junk. I pressed my best tablecloth, the one with tiny embroidered flowers I'd sewn with my husband decades ago. I went through the cupboards and took out my mother's china, the set I only used for special occasions. As I ran my hand across the smooth porcelain, I could almost hear my husband's voice again, that soft chuckle when he'd say, "You don't need an occasion, Mary. Make one." And that's exactly what I was doing, making an occasion they'd never forget. That afternoon, I baked their favorite pie, the one they always demanded I make cherry, with the crust brushed perfectly with butter. The scent filled the kitchen, sweet and warm, but it no longer felt like something made out of love. It was something else now, deliberate, final. I hummed softly as I worked, just as I used to when my son was a little boy, running around the kitchen, tugging at my apron. I thought of the small things I had done for him over the years, the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, the meals I skipped so he could eat better, the dreams I gave up so he could chase his own. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten all that. But I hadn't. The house felt different that evening. The clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, each sound echoing through the stillness. I could feel the tension in the air, though no one else was there to sense it. I set the table with care, plates perfectly aligned, glasses shining under the light, every fork and napkin placed just so. To anyone else it might have looked like I was preparing dinner. But I wasn't. I was preparing their lesson. When I finished, I stood for a moment and looked around. The house was spotless, every corner gleaming. I lit a single candle in the center of the table, its flame steady and calm. It reminded me of myself, quiet, but not weak. They thought my silence meant surrender. What they didn't understand was that silence can be a mother's armor, a shield stronger than any outburst. Outside, the sky began to dim, the last traces of sunlight fading. I glanced at the clock. They would be here soon, expecting the same warm meal, the same obedient mother, the same easy comfort they'd always known. But tonight would be different. Tonight, they would see the truth of what they'd done and who I truly was. I smoothed the front of my dress, took a deep breath, and whispered to myself, "It's time." 2 days before their next visit, I dressed early in the morning and took the bus downtown. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and fallen leaves. I clutched my small purse close to me as I stepped into the bank, the same one I'd been walking into for nearly 30 years. The marble floors gleamed, the same as always, but this time my steps felt heavier, more deliberate. I wasn't here to make a deposit. I was here to reclaim my life. I walked up to the counter, where a young teller greeted me with a practiced smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" she asked. I handed her my ID and account details. "I need to close a joint account," I said calmly. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "Joint account?" she repeated, glancing at the name beside mine, my son's. I nodded once. "Yes. I'm the primary holder. I want it closed immediately." She looked at me, surprised, perhaps even a little concerned. "Are you sure about this, ma'am? It might take a few minutes, and once it's done, it can't be reversed." I smiled, not the polite kind I'd been forced to give for years, but a real one, quiet and certain. "More than ever," I said. As she processed the paperwork, I thought about how easily trust can turn into a weapon when it's placed in the wrong hands. Every dollar I had earned, every sacrifice I had made, had been poured into that account, an account my own son had claimed as his right. But not anymore. When she finally handed me the closing forms, I signed my name with steady hands. My signature looked different this time, stronger, as if each letter carried a piece of my dignity stitched back into it. When she slid the check across the counter, I didn't hesitate. I told her to divide it into 3 transactions. First, a portion was to be donated to the local women's shelter, a place that had once helped a neighbor escape an abusive home years ago. "Make it anonymous," I said softly. The teller looked at me, eyes softening, and nodded. The second portion was to be moved into a new private trust that Michael, my lawyer friend, had helped me set up. It was designed so that I could live comfortably without ever needing anyone's permission again. The final amount, a smaller part I kept in cash, neatly sealed in an envelope. Not for spending, but for memory, for closure. When the teller finished, she said, "That's everything, ma'am. The joint account has been officially closed." Her tone carried a hint of respect now, something people rarely offer to women they assume are fragile. I thanked her, folded the receipts carefully into my purse, and walked out of the bank feeling lighter than I had in years. Outside, the world seemed brighter. The clouds were parting, sunlight spilling over the wet pavement. I stopped at the corner and watched the traffic go by, people rushing through their day, unaware of the quiet victories happening around them. For me, this wasn't just a financial errand, it was the end of submission. The end of letting someone else decide my worth. As I boarded the bus back home, I caught my reflection in the window, a face lined with years, but alive with something fierce and calm. For the first time in a long while, I didn't see defeat. I saw peace. I knew that the next time he came for dinner, everything he thought he owned would be gone. The evening sunlight poured gently through the kitchen window, casting a soft golden glow across the room. It was the kind of light that makes everything look peaceful, warm, forgiving, almost nostalgic. I moved slowly around the table, adjusting the silverware, aligning each plate, smoothing out the folds in the tablecloth one last time. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and cinnamon, their favorites, of course. To anyone else, it would have looked like a simple Sunday dinner. But to me, this was a moment years in the making. Every gesture, every detail, was deliberate. I wanted everything to be perfect, not out of love this time, but out of respect for myself. I placed 2 tall glasses at the head of the table, poured fresh water, and stepped back to admire my work. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the oven and the slow ticking of the clock. It was a strange kind of calm, the kind that only comes when you've already made peace with what's about to happen. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't even angry anymore. I was simply ready. Ready for them to see what silence had been hiding all along. I glanced toward the small envelope, tucked neatly inside my purse, resting on the counter a copy of my new will, signed and sealed. The lawyer's card was beside it, just in case. I had left no loose ends, no lingering ties for them to pull. The house, once filled with laughter and trust, now held only truth. As I lit the candles, their flames flickered gently, reflecting in the polished silver like tiny reminders of everything I had endured. I walked over to the living room window and peeked outside. The driveway was empty, but I knew they'd be here soon. They never missed a meal, especially one that didn't cost them a thing. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it faint at first, then clearer. Their laughter. That familiar, carefree laughter that once warmed my heart but now echoed with something else entirely. They were walking up the path, talking loudly, carefree, as if the world still revolved around them. My son's voice carried through the evening air, confident, almost boastful. His wife followed with her usual tone, sharp and teasing. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes and listened. It struck me how different those voices sounded now. Once, they meant home and comfort. Now, they were reminders of entitlement and betrayal. Yet, I didn't feel hatred, just clarity. They had no idea what they were walking into. The doorbell rang. A calm and deliberate chime that cut through the stillness. I straightened my posture, wiped my hands on my apron, and took one last look at the table. The scene was perfect, almost cinematic. The aroma of the meal lingered in the air, and the light from the setting sun wrapped everything in gold. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "Showtime." As I opened the door, their laughter spilled into the house like it always did. But tonight, that laughter wouldn't last long. I greeted them with a gentle smile, just as I always had. My son leaned forward to kiss my cheek, his wife brushing past me with her usual air of superiority. "Smells amazing, Mom," she said with a grin. "You really do spoil us." I smiled faintly, stepping aside to let them in. "I suppose I do," I replied. My voice was calm, almost too calm. As they made their way to the table, I followed behind, my hands steady, my heart quiet. They laughed again, settling into their usual seats, unaware that tonight wasn't just another dinner. It was the unveiling of the truth, a truth they had spent years avoiding. I stood by the doorway for a moment, watching them fill their plates, oblivious to the change that had already taken place. And as the candlelight danced across their faces, I thought to myself, they have no idea they're about to walk into the truth. The laughter faded the moment they stepped inside. My son froze mid-step, his wife's smile stiffened. Their eyes darted from the perfectly set dinner table to the unfamiliar man seated calmly at the head of it. A brief silence filled the room, heavy, uncertain. The only sound was the ticking clock on the wall and the faint hiss of the oven cooling down. The man rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. His presence was steady, composed, the kind of quiet authority that makes even the confident hesitate. My son looked from him to me, confusion clouding his face. "Mom?" he said carefully, his tone carrying a nervous laugh. "What's going on?" I smiled softly, resting my hands on the back of my chair. "Dinner," I replied, my voice calm but deliberate. "And closure." My daughter-in-law blinked rapidly, her eyes flicking toward the stranger. "Closure?" she repeated, forcing a chuckle. "What does that even mean?" The lawyer glanced at me, and I gave him a small nod. He opened the leather folder before him, neat, precise, and devastating. Papers, contracts, seals, all in order. "Good evening," he began smoothly. "My name is Mr. Caldwell. I represent Mrs. Emerson." He paused, emphasizing Mrs. Emerson, as though reminding them that I was no longer anyone's dependent. "Effective as of this morning," he continued, "you no longer have access to her financial accounts. All assets have been transferred to a private trust under her sole control." The words hung in the air like thunder. My son blinked, trying to process. "What do you mean? No access?" His voice cracked slightly. The lawyer didn't flinch. "Exactly that, Mr. Emerson. Every joint account has been closed. New beneficiaries have been assigned. Furthermore, this home," he gestured around the room, "has been legally removed from your name and returned entirely to your mother's ownership." My daughter-in-law's face went pale. "That's not possible," she snapped. We helped her with the bills, with maintenance. This is our family home." The lawyer turned a page, calm as ever. "According to the records, every expense came from Mrs. Emerson's personal funds. There's no documentation of shared contribution." Her jaw dropped. "You're lying." My son's voice cut through hers. "Mom, what's this about?" he demanded, his tone shifting from disbelief to anger. "Why would you do this?" I looked at him quietly. The same boy I once tucked into bed. The same man who told me I didn't need money because I didn't need anything. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "I did this," I said softly, "because I finally remembered who I am." He stared at me, searching for the mother who always forgave him, who always gave in. But she was gone. In her place stood someone who had learned the art of silence and the power of peace. The lawyer began gathering his documents. "You may contact my office if you need clarification," he said, standing. "But to be clear, all legal transfers are complete. There is nothing to dispute." My son's wife slammed her hand on the table. "You can't just take everything," she hissed. "You can't just—" I looked at her calmly. "I didn't take anything," I said. "I simply reclaimed what was mine." The lawyer nodded respectfully and stepped aside. My son's face had drained of all color. He sank slowly into the nearest chair, staring blankly at the papers that had rewritten his life. He stared at me, speechless. The woman who didn't need money had just outsmarted him in silence. I stood there, watching the storm settle in their eyes, disbelief, anger, humiliation. But there was something else underneath it all. Fear. The fear of realizing the person they had underestimated was the one holding every card. And just as the silence thickened, there came another sound, a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Everyone turned. My son's wife frowned. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked sharply. I said nothing. My gaze stayed fixed on the door as I walked toward it. When I opened it, 2 familiar faces stepped in, her parents, dressed neatly, expressions stern. The color drained from my daughter-in-law's face. "Mom? Dad? What are you?" Her mother cut her off sharply. "We got your call, Mrs. Emerson," she said to me, "and the documents you sent us. We didn't want to believe it." Her father stepped forward, his voice low. "Our daughter has been lying to us for years. About money, about who paid for this house, even about you. The room fell into stunned silence. My daughter-in-law stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing but no words coming out. My son turned toward her, realization dawning like a slow, painful sunrise. But it wasn't the money that broke him. It was who else walked in next. The candles flickered in the still air as every secret in that room, every lie, every manipulation began to unravel in the golden light of that quiet evening. The door slammed so hard the walls trembled. Their voices echoed down the driveway, shouts of disbelief, denial, betrayal. But inside, everything was still. The kind of stillness that comes after a long storm finally breaks, and the air feels new again. I stayed where I was, standing beside the table that once hosted laughter, arguments, and countless Sunday dinners. The plates were untouched, the roast untouched, the candles half burned. Their chairs were pushed back hastily, one of them knocked sideways in anger. The house, for the first time in years, was mine again. I moved slowly, deliberately, collecting the silverware and straightening the napkins they had tossed aside. My hands didn't shake. My breathing was calm, steady. On the sideboard, a single cup of tea waited, steam curling gently toward the ceiling. I took it in both hands and sat down. For a long moment, I just listened. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The old clock on the wall resumed its rhythm, a sound I had missed more than I realized. Each tick felt like a heartbeat returning after years of silence. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I just let the quiet fill the room. The tea was still warm. I sipped it slowly, letting the taste linger, jasmine and honey, the same blend my husband used to make. A tear didn't fall. There was no need. My peace had already spoken louder than any argument ever could. Outside, the wind carried their voices away, shrinking them into whispers, then nothing. Inside, all that remained was calm and freedom. I looked around the living room at the framed photographs, the soft light spilling across the old rug, the chair where I used to rock my son as a baby. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. For years, I had believed silence was weakness. Tonight, I learned it could be power. I set my cup down, watching the ripples fade. And in that stillness, I smiled not out of victory, but out of release. If this moment gave you chills, share this story with someone who's ever been taken for granted. Sometimes, one share is all it takes to remind another woman she's not alone. The clock continued ticking as the camera slowly panned across the room. The empty chairs, the cooling dinner, the quiet dignity of a woman who had reclaimed her life. The following weeks passed like quiet dawns after a long, bitter winter. I didn't rush to fill the silence, I embraced it. The house that had once felt like a battlefield was finally empty, so I packed up what mattered most. Old photo albums, a few of my husband's letters, and the teacup I'd held the night everything changed. The rest, I left behind: the furniture, the memories, the ghosts. They could keep those. I moved into a smaller home on the edge of town, a place with creaking floors and wildflowers that grew freely by the porch. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. Every morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains and touched my face like a promise. I'd wake up to birds instead of shouting, to peace instead of pity. Neighbors would wave as I watered the garden, and I found myself smiling again, not because life was perfect, but because it was finally honest. There were no expectations, no guilt, no one to explain myself to. I could breathe. One afternoon, I walked past the community center near the park, the same one where my husband used to volunteer. A flyer on the bulletin board read, "Help needed mentors for nursing students." I stood there for a while, reading it over and over. My hands still remembered the rhythm of care, the way to comfort someone scared or uncertain. So I signed up. The next week, I stood before a group of young nurses, all nervous smiles and restless hands, and I shared stories. Not about money or betrayal, but about endurance, compassion, and knowing your worth even when others can't see it. Their eyes shone with the same hope I once had, and in their laughter, I found something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Days turned into weeks, and I realized I no longer checked my phone waiting for apologies that would never come. I didn't need closure from them anymore. The closure came every time I helped someone else believe in themselves again. Sometimes, when I walked home from the center, I'd catch the reflection of the sunset on the glass windows, golden and forgiving, and I'd whisper to myself, "You did it. You made it through." They took my money, but I kept my peace, and that made me richer than ever. I learned that losing everything isn't the end, it's the clearing before the new beginning. And as I sat on my porch, sipping tea from that same old cup, I knew that the woman who once stayed silent had finally spoken, not with words, but with the life she chose to live. It was a late autumn evening when I heard the knock. Soft at first, hesitant, the kind of knock that carries guilt more than courage. The porch light flickered as I opened the door, and there he was, my son. The same man who once looked me in the eye and told me I didn't need my own money now stood before me with hollow eyes and trembling hands. His shoulders slumped as if life had finally taught him the lesson I couldn't. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The silence between us wasn't angry anymore. It was heavy with years of choices, mistakes, and unspoken love. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Mom, I lost everything. The business, the house, even she left. I didn't know where else to go. I could have closed the door. I could have said everything that had lived rent-free in my heart for years, all the pain, the humiliation, the lonely nights, but I didn't." I stepped aside, letting the soft glow of the living room spill onto the porch. "Come in, son," I said quietly. "It's cold out there." He hesitated, eyes glistening, before stepping inside. The scent of tea and cinnamon filled the air, the same comfort he grew up with, the one he had long forgotten. He looked around the small house, the simplicity of it, the warmth. "You look happy here," he whispered. "I am," I replied. Peace doesn't need much space. We sat at the table, just like old times, though the silence now carried a gentler tone. He tried to speak, to apologize, to explain, but I raised my hand softly. "You don't need to," I said. "I already forgave you a long time ago, not for you, for me. Holding on to pain would have made me just like the people who hurt me." Tears streamed down his face, his hands trembling as he covered them. "I don't deserve it," he murmured. "No one really does," I said, sipping my tea. "That's the point." He nodded slowly, unable to meet my eyes. For the first time in years, I saw not the man who took from me, but the boy I once held when he was scared of thunderstorms. That same fear was in his face now, not of punishment, but of being unloved. I reached across the table, placing my hand on his. "You've lost a lot, son, but losing everything can sometimes be the only way to find yourself again." He nodded, a quiet sob escaping him. "Can I come by sometimes?" "Of course," I said. "But remember, coming by is one thing. Coming back, that takes work." He smiled faintly through the tears, understanding exactly what I meant. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's choosing peace over poison. As he left that night, the wind carried the scent of rain, cleansing, new, forgiving. I closed the door gently and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. The past was still there, but it no longer defined me. Because forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what he'd done. It meant remembering who I was, a woman who could survive betrayal, rebuild her life, and still have room in her heart for grace. The morning sun poured gently through the curtains, laying soft, golden lines across the photo frames that lined the small wooden shelf. Each picture told a story: my husband holding our newborn son, our little family at the county fair, birthdays spent laughing in the backyard before life grew complicated. I traced a finger over one photo: my son, no older than 10, missing a front tooth and grinning proudly with a homemade kite in his hands. For a moment, I could almost hear his laughter again, high and free. That sound had been my reason to keep going, even when everything else fell apart. Life had taken me through storms, widowhood, loneliness, betrayal, but it never took away the one thing I refused to give up: my dignity. Dignity isn't loud, it doesn't demand attention or applause. It's the quiet knowing that no matter how people treat you, they can't define your worth. My son thought money was power, that control meant love. But true power, I learned, comes from peace, the kind that can't be taken from your hands because it lives in your heart. Money fades, power fades, but dignity never does. It outlasts the noise, the greed, and the selfishness. It sits beside you when everyone else has walked away, reminding you that you are enough, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. I had given him life, and in the end, life gave me wisdom. Sometimes, silence is the loudest revenge, not because it hurts the other person, but because it heals you. Silence gives space for reflection, for peace, for truth. It turns bitterness into balance and heartbreak into strength. I looked again at that smiling boy in the photo and whispered softly, "You came back, and that's enough." I knew tomorrow would bring its own quiet, but this time it wouldn't be loneliness. It would be peace, the kind you earn, not by fighting, but by letting go. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs this reminder. You can lose everything and still win your peace. Anyway,